Hi, Professor Stott and the rest of English 301. My name is Amanda Shaw, and for week one, the topic is the limitations of common sense. So, first thing to start off with is what exactly is common sense? Now, based on the notes that were provided and my personal opinion, I believe that common sense is something that the average person or most people can understand and is kind of just known. It is considered common knowledge. So, that being said, and with that definition, I want to go into what limitations of common sense are. And there's definitely a bunch of categories that can be broken down into for limitations. So that being said, the first one could be where you live, and are you alienated or are you exposed? So say you live in a rural area where there may not be something for miles, so your next door neighbor could be miles down the road, versus living in an urban area where it's highly populated, there's a lot of commotion going on, you're exposed to a lot more diversity. So where you live and what type of exposure you get based off of that can definitely limit what's considered common knowledge. Perfect example would be it's common sense in New York City that a lot of people jaywalk, or there's certain sides of the street that you should be parked on, or there's just many different type of beliefs and things that are common knowledge that if you're maybe from a rural area that may not be such common knowledge. So a second example would be your cultural exposure. So basically that could be your religion or how you were raised and your background. So basically what your ancestors have instilled in you. So, in terms of religion, if you take, say, the Jewish religion, it is common sense that you are not supposed to have any form of tattoo or ink. You are supposed to leave the natural world the same way you entered it. So, that being said, it is the common sense that you cannot be buried in a Jewish cemetery if you have anything permanent on your body. Now, for other religions, say as in Catholicism or Christianity, that's not necessarily common knowledge or a common thing followed. So, also your background and maybe what your parents had instilled in you and their parents had instilled in them, that can definitely limit what is considered common knowledge. So, even say if you grew up in America versus growing up in Asia, so in America, you wouldn't necessarily see if you walk into a school that you automatically take off your shoes as a sign of respect or you bow down to your ancestors. And respect is a huge common courtesy in Asia. So if you go to Asia, all the students automatically take off their shoes and their school days are much longer, and respect is also tied into intelligence, and their students must do perform very well in school, whereas in America it's very different, and the same can go for other cultures. So there's also beliefs and prejudices. So with beliefs, it could also tie into religion. So and that with that also ties into sexuality and gender. So certain religions have beliefs that it is not acceptable for gay marriage or interracial marriage or anything along those lines. So it would be common sense for one religion per se that gay marriage is not accepted. Now, with that, can also tie into where you live. So certain states are accepting of it, and it is common knowledge that two gay men or lesbian women can um, form a union. So that can be a belief, and there's also many people have different beliefs just based on how they were raised and whatnot. And then ties in with prejudices. So a perfect example, as was described in the notes, about slavery. Back in the 1900s, early 1900s, slavery was considered common sense. The majority, thus being the white Americans, could own and basically do whatever they want with the African Americans. Now, also, you take something like the Holocaust, where there was prejudice against the Nazis had prejudice against the Jews. Um, and that was obviously between Israel and the Germans. So prejudices can also influence the limitations of common sense. Of course, back then, it was considered common that you can put Jewish people in a concentration camp and kill them, and they were considered lower than the average person, or in today's society that is completely not acceptable, and it is not common that you would see swastikas posted everywhere or that you can enslave certain people. Same thing with the Japanese internment camps. It was common way back when that you can put these people and treat them as though they're below the average person, but today that is completely not acceptable. So with that, um, it's known that common sense changes over time and through history. So things that were acceptable in the 1800s or early 1900s is not acceptable in 2013 and in the future. And as I'm sure future progresses, things that are acceptable today may not necessarily be acceptable 20, 30, 100 years down the line. So something that was in the notes that I thought was definitely interesting, where it says history shows us that common sense is a social construct that reflects the political and ideological orthodoxies of the time. So that just sums up of what was acceptable in the early 1900s is not necessarily acceptable in 2013. So the last type of category that can influence and be a limitation for common sense would be one's education. So, perfect example, if you were educated in a suburban or urban area, may be very different from being educated, say, in an Amish area. And the example of that would be with technology. In an Amish community, they don't believe in using technology such as phones, computers, anything like that. They're very basic people. And there's nothing wrong with that, of course. However, if you go into a suburban school, like say the one that I went to, technology is used with everything that is taught. Excuse the phone in the background. Um, so that can definitely influence one's exposure. And there's nothing wrong with either one. Like I said, common sense is neither positive nor negative. It can be whatever you make of it. However, it does have its limitations, and you can look at it from both ends of the spectrum. So that being said, if you break that down even further, if you are in a public school versus a private school, your exposure is different. Or an urban school versus any other type of school or a charter school, your exposure is different no matter where you're educated. And some are more exposed to certain things than others. It's just like if you went to a Catholic school versus going to a yeshiva versus going to a public school. You're exposed to different things and what is deemed important by that school and the curriculum to expose the students to. So the way I wanted to kind of sum this all up was in Psychology Today, which is um, a magazine, but I found it online. I had found an article published by Jim Taylor, who has his doctorate, and it was published on July 12, 2011, on Common Sense is Neither Common Nor Sense. So he summed this up by saying, common sense is neither common nor sense. There's not a whole of sound judgment going on these days, though whether it is worse than in the past, I can't be sure. So it's not common. If common sense was common, then most people wouldn't make the kinds of decisions they do every day. People wouldn't buy stuff they can't afford. They wouldn't smoke cigarettes or eat junk food. They wouldn't gamble. And if you want to get really specific and timely, politicians wouldn't be tweeting pictures of their private parts to strangers. In other words, people wouldn't do the multitude of things that are clearly not good for them. And common sense isn't real sense. If we define sense as being sound judgment, because relying on experience alone doesn't usually offer enough information to draw reliable conclusions, heck, I think common sense is a contradiction in terms. Real sense can rarely be derived from experience alone because most people's experiences are limited. So that being said, and of course I will provide the proper citations for that excerpt, common sense, there's definitely a lot of limitations to it based on your exposure and how you were brought up, and nothing is right versus wrong or wrong versus right. It's just what you were exposed to, and what people were exposed to way back when is different from what is exposed to today, and what people are exposed to today is going to be completely different from what people are exposed to in the future. So to be able to figure out what's common sense for you, you kind of have to look back to how you were raised, your background, your beliefs, your prejudices, what has been instilled in you, and compare it to how it has affected other people and what limitations other people have had. So that's the perfect way to find out who you are and your place in society. So I hope you enjoyed, and this was nice and informal, and I look forward to hearing back from you. Thank you.